evening elsewhere around the world where our audience is coming from. So it's a great pleasure to have all of you join our session today. Today is really the second day of the Aid for Trade Global Review. And as many of you have heard from previous sessions, this year's Global Review comes at a very, very important time when it is critical in multiple ways that we can direct support to where it is most needed, especially because there could be multiplicative gains as we see taking into consideration the different global crises. I'll quote the WT on this. Trade is an integral part of the transition to low carbon models of growth and a just climate transition. And as we've seen from the several estimates different reports have produced in the last 5 years, the scale of support and the amount of financing that is required for this, especially in the low-income context, cannot be underestimated. Needless to say, today's discussion is very, very vital. So in this session, we want to explore the different opportunities that LDCs can reap from the ongoing global transition to a low-carbon world and the trade benefits they can derive from their own carbon competitiveness. We'll find out later what this whole concept of carbon competitiveness actually means. We want to find out how the greening of aid for trade can help LDCs adopt climate smart agriculture, build capacity for trade facilitating reforms in goods and services markets, and help LDC exporters meet regulatory requirements of developed country markets. So today's high-level panel was put together by exceptional colleagues in the Executive Secretariat for the Enhanced Integrated Framework, the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation, and the World Bank Group. And to our audience today, please do not be shy. Put your questions in the chat box. We're interested in a very interactive session, and it is not very often that we get such a high level, excellent group of panelists. So this is your opportunity to really ask them some of those questions that you've been curious about. To kickstart our discussion and to answer some of the questions that we often wonder about, how implementation of support programs to LDCs actually evolves over time. We're delighted to be hearing the German perspective from our first panelist. Unfortunately, he could not join us today, but he's shared a pre-recorded message that we shall be hearing. So Dirk Meyer serves as Director General for Global Health, Private Sector, Trade and Rural Development at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development in Berlin. Let's hear his take on what greening aid for trade in LDCs, really means, what they have done in the German context, and also understand the German support to LDCs in greening their trade with examples from trade facilitation, quality infrastructure, and climate smart agriculture. So please, Adeline, if you could project Dirk's message, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Excellencies, distinguished experts, ladies and gentlemen. First, I would like to thank colleagues from the World Bank and the Enhanced Integrated Framework for putting together this important event. Unfortunately, I cannot be with you in Geneva right now and will therefore convey my points virtually. I'm delighted to be part of this session on the challenges and opportunities at the nexus of trade and climate change, and on the needs of least developed countries. In the last few weeks and months, the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine and its terrible effects, which are being felt all around the world, have dominated debates. However, the climate crisis continues to be one of the most pressing problems of our times. We have to stay committed to our goal of achieving climate neutrality. At the same time, we have to make sure that climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts in our trade relationships do not leave the most vulnerable economies behind. Hence, we have to support LDCs so as to enable them to adjust and to seize the opportunities of sustainable trade. How can we approach this task? Let me start with a quote from the World Bank study, The Trade and Climate Change Nexus. While trade contributes to climate change, it is also a central part of the solution. This sums it up exactly. We are all aware of the negative effects of trade in relation to climate change, whether through emissions or through environmental degradation. But trade can also be a crucial lever for implementing the 2030 agenda and for fighting the climate crisis. Trade helps with scaling up green production methods by opening new markets and by diffusing green technologies. The value of global trade in green goods is currently estimated at $1 trillion a year, and this figure is increasing. However, for trade to have this positive impact and in order to mitigate its negative impact on climate change, we need to rethink our trade agreements and regulations. The outcome document of the 12th Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization is an encouraging and imperative signal in this regard. It stresses the contribution of the multilateral trading system towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals with a focus on environmental sustainability. There is a lot of work to be done now in order to operationalize this political signal. Let's get started on it. At the same time, we have to be mindful that environmental standards are and will be even more so in the future a precondition for market access. This is a challenge, but it can also be an opportunity for least developed countries. The low carbon intensity of goods from least developed countries can become a key advantage for their exports, bearing in mind, for example, the efforts to introduce carbon border adjustment mechanisms in the European Union. However, in order to exploit these opportunities, quality infrastructure is necessary so that carbon emissions released by production processes can be measured, reported, and verified. This will require adequate technical assistance, which is one very practical example of green aid for trade. Germany is ready to provide such green aid for trade. We have made just transition a priority of our development policy. In light of the proposal by the European Commission for a directive on corporate sustainability due diligence, which includes climate-related obligations, we have initiated a Team Europe initiative on sustainability in global supply chains last year. The Team Europe initiative will serve to coordinate a comprehensive set of support measures for companies in Europe, as well as for their direct and indirect suppliers in producer countries. In this context, we are also providing technical assistance to companies in developing countries for measuring their CO2 footprint. In concluding, I would like to highlight that we would appreciate further exchange on promising approaches with others who have embarked on the journey of greening aid for trade. I look forward to the next opportunity to meet and discuss these topics in Geneva in person. I now wish you a fruitful discussion and thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dirk, in that pre-recorded message. I think he stressed a very important point, the fact that we need to rethink the regulations that pertain to trade and climate change and environmental issues, and also highlighting the different initiatives that the German government has put in place to provide technical assistance that helps in measuring, reporting, and verification. I think that is a very important issue that our next panelist could probably touch upon in her interventions. The next panelist is Ms. Mona Haddad, who we're privileged to have in our panel today. She is the Global Director for Trade, Investment and Competitiveness in the Equitable Growth Finance and Institutions Practice Group of the World Bank Group. She has been with the World Bank Group since 1992 and has served in several capacities spanning numerous continents over time. Ms. Haddad, the World Bank Group is heavily engaged in the arena of climate change and development, both through funding, providing a lot of financing, as well as through producing, really strong analytical products. From your perspective, what areas do you think are top priorities for consideration when we think about the future of trade and the low carbon transition and the role of trade policy? Further, are there any emerging opportunities for LDCs, and what do they really look like? Ms. Haddad, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vicky. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And it's a pleasure for me to be part of this panel and to share some perspectives on such an important agenda. I'm also happy to see the strong collaboration between the World Bank, the EIF Secretariat, and the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development on this topic. This year, the World Bank launched a series of country climate and development reports, what we call the CCDRs, as one of the main components of our climate change action plan for 2021 to 25. Broadly, the action plan aims to deliver record levels of climate finance to developing countries, reduce emissions, strengthen adaptation, and align financial flows with the goals of the Paris Agreement. CCDRs, which will eventually be rolled out for each of our client countries, are a new core diagnostics aimed to help countries align climate action and development efforts and absorb new climate-related technologies as they emerge. The climate issues that are covered in CCDRs are complex and vast, and the cost for implementation of the ensuing climate action plans and measures is high. For example, in the CCDR for Vietnam, we find that the country needs to invest approximately $370 billion from now until 2040 to build a climate resilient and low carbon economy. Total financing needs for decarbonization only are estimated at $114 billion over 2022 to 2040, 64 billion of which to support the energy transition, 17 billion for industry, transport, and agriculture, and 33 billion for supportive social programs. Green Aid for Trade programs should and are part of this agenda, and they are necessary to enhance resilience and better enable countries to seize sustainable trade opportunities. Today, I want to focus on three main priority areas that we need to channel aid for trade towards. First is the need to accurately showcase the carbon competitiveness. Our recent flagship report, the Trade and Climate Change Nexus, which you, Vicky, have co-authored, highlights that developing countries' trade will be impacted by policy measures and private sector actions in other countries that are introduced to mitigate carbon emissions. For example, while an analysis for Vietnam shows that the impact of the EU Green Deal's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the CBAM, may be limited initially, other countries are likely to introduce similar mechanisms with expanded reach as consumer demand shifts toward cleaner products and firms implement changes in their production processes to remain competitive. An example from the private sector is the case of Apple, which is transitioning its entire supply chain to 100% clean energy. Foxconn, one of Apple's major suppliers, which has recently moved its assembly lines to Vietnam, will be subject to Apple's environmental and social governance and decarbonization requirements. Therefore, the ability to reduce carbon emissions and the ability to do so in a verifiable way will affect competitiveness in a major way moving forward. LDCs need to understand their carbon competitiveness in key exports, including the pattern of their emissions compared with those of other countries, and the ability of their producers to benefit from carbon efficiencies through instruments such as sustainability criteria, standards, and certification. A first step is to work on accurately showcasing or measuring carbon competitiveness in order to facilitate this trade. But carbon accounting methodologies are complex and difficult to implement. The data needed for such detailed carbon accounting are extensive. Also, verification of emissions is required because it's not possible to tell the difference between high and low carbon products from simple inspections at the border. Take the example of aluminum, which has half the carbon footprint if produced from recycled material as compared with raw aluminum. And no customs officer can really tell the difference. There's no broad consensus on how to calculate carbon footprints for products, even though several organizations have developed competing international standards, and data is often a problem. Moreover, the choice of methodology, limited data availability, and uncertainty about key variables can paint a misleading picture of the carbon footprint of developing country exports. It's also important that the developers of standards and their users apply emissions factors relevant for developing countries, and that there is transparency in the use of carbon accounting methodologies and data sources. Let me move to the second priority, which is the need to leverage existing green opportunities. Firstly, do LDCs have the potential to produce renewables and other low carbon products? The answer is yes. For example, 5 of the 10 countries with the greatest solar potential are in Africa, including Namibia, Egypt, Lesotho, Libya, and Botswana. For the minerals needed in the production of the low carbon technologies, Africa has abundant reserves. DR Congo, for example, is the leading world producer of cobalt, which is used in batteries and electric vehicles. And Africa holds roughly half of global reserves. Guinea also has the world's largest reserves of bauxite, which is used in solar. So there's significant potential, but support will be required to harness these opportunities. Secondly, we should not forget that there is also vast potential to build thriving green economies beyond the renewable energy sector. In a continent like Africa, where many countries remain energy poor, there's a tendency to focus on the need to implement renewable energy, such as in wind and solar. But combating the climate crisis should be viewed in a holistic way, and striking a balance will be key. Agriculture, for example, is an area of promise. Climate-resistant forms of agriculture can help mitigate the continent's food security crisis while capturing carbon from the atmosphere. Forestry activities, including conservation and reforestation, can also be a job creator and a vital tool for carbon capture. So Aid for Trade directed at supporting the development of renewable energy, as well as carbon sequestration and conservation agriculture, could have multiplicative gains. The third priority is the need to facilitate the exchange of environmental goods and services, products that contribute to climate and environmental goals. Several countries are already engaged in this type of trade. In 2020, Vietnam, for example, was the third largest exporters of environmental goods in Southeast Asia, with exports valued at over $6 billion. And it was the second larger importer at $13 billion. Vietnam's trade in environmental products has mostly involved renewable energy products. But there are opportunities to expand such trade by reducing non-tariff barriers on environmental goods and services. Indeed, the barriers to trade in environmental goods are mostly non-tariff barriers, and eliminating them should be a top priority. These barriers vary by country, but they mostly include technical barriers to trade and sanitary and phytosanitary measures. These measures or regulations are put in place for many good reasons, including health, safety, and environmental protection. But the ambiguity in the application of these regulations can be exploited for trade restrictive purposes. Other non-tariff barriers include local content requirements, specifically requirements that incentivize the use of locally sourced materials, cumbersome certification, and licensing procedures and price controls. Addressing these non-tariff barriers by monitoring them closely and eliminating them when needed will be fundamentally important to facilitate environmental goods trade. In terms of tariffs on environmental goods, in general, they are low, but there are important exceptions for certain products and countries. A few island states, for example, levy very high tariffs of 20% or more on environmental goods. Of the larger low and middle income economies, Argentina, Brazil, Ethiopia, and the Central African Economic and Monetary Community countries, the CEMAC countries, have average tariffs on environmental goods above 10%, although there's considerable variability across countries. Brazil, for example, levies a 14% tariff on blades and hubs, which are integral components of wind turbines. By contrast, Ethiopia has a 0% duty on these products. So there is room to further reduce tariffs in many cases. Measures to boost trade in environmental services are also key. Environmental services are sine qua non to the appropriate functioning of environmental goods. As such, taking measures to increase trade in them should happen in tandem. Let me say in conclusion that we have an opportunity here. A recent Financial Times article on whether Africa can grow without fossil fuels mentions that African countries should go green not through any sense of moral obligation, but as a pragmatic response to a new billion-dollar opportunity. And I agree. While most Western countries are already locked into a carbon-intensive path, most of Africa, on the other hand, has yet to build its energy infrastructure and manufacturing base, so it should be easier to adopt new technologies that can foster greener growth trajectories. Additionally, Africa's agriculture products could fetch a competitive edge in global markets because of their low carbon intensity. LDCs will need significant support to overcome many of these challenges. And that's why today's discussion is so important. We are already in the green transition. We are observing changes in consumer demand and preferences, and that will ultimately affect a country's trading potential. As such, what countries trade in will be viewed with greater scrutiny on the emission intensity of their production processes. Building resilience and adaptation will even become more critical as the frequency of climate change-related events occur. Gearing aid for trade to focus on addressing some of these challenges will be increasingly important. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Haddad. Your intervention really clearly illustrated to us what opportunities look like, especially for LDCs. You pointed out even country-specific sort of comparative advantages, and I think today is sort of a nice discussion to have.
Vicky, you seem to have gone on mute.
Oh no, I've been muted. Sorry. I just wanted to say that, Ms. Haddad, thank you so much for clearly pointing to us some of the LDC opportunities that exist. The fact that there are already existing comparative advantages that could be taken, advantage of, and perhaps a discussion like today's helps us to sort of change our focus to harness some of these opportunities going forward. I also like the fact that you stressed this very critical point, the need to take into account the realities of the least developed world in designing some of these carbon accounting methodologies and regulations. And that is a very perfect segue into our next speaker, who will touch upon how LDC participation at the WTO is very important, WTO being the rulemaking body. So it is an absolute honor to have Ambassador Jean-Marie Pogam, who is currently the Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. He has held senior management positions in the French government on trade, most recently as permanent representative of France to the WTO. He has also held a number of senior positions in the French Ministry of Economy and Finance, including as a member of the Executive Committee of the French Treasury. He has also served as Deputy Executive Director of the International Trade Center in Geneva. Ambassador Pogam, it's a pleasure to have you. How can aid for trade be leveraged to help LDCs meet these rising product standards in importing markets? The sort of stuff we have had Ms. Haddad speak in her intervention. How can aid for trade also sustain greater LDC participation in the WTO's joint statement initiatives, discussions on trade, environment, and climate change? Are there also any opportunity costs that are borne through limited participation? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair, dear Vicky, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll just start by very shortly just saying that we converge with the assessment that LDCs are particularly vulnerable to climate change for everything which has been said already or documented, geographical reasons, importance of the agricultural sector, vulnerable infrastructures, difficulties in accessing technologies, and so on and so forth. I think from a trade perspective, and even more from a WTO perspective, which is not exactly all the trade, what is at stake is that is to make sure that the LDCs are not going, on top of their vulnerability to climate change, to become victims of the responses, of the trade responses to climate change. So they're not going to be double punished by their vulnerability plus the responses of the others. I see three big challenges here. The first one has been largely covered by Mona Haddad, and I absolutely converge with her. It is the impact of zero net strategies at public and private sector levels. Of course, I'm not disputing at all the relevance of such strategies. They are needed. They are even too slow from an environmental perspective. The thing is that the design does not necessarily take into account the needs of LDCs in international trade. I could take three examples. I will not detail all that because I think Mona did say a lot. You have the private sector strategies through corporate social governance or social responsibility, which have a deep impact in sourcing in developing countries. You have the impact of public technical regulations, which can be legitimate, but obstacle or difficult compliance measures to trade. And you have, of course, the different carbon border adjustments, which are considered by several countries. All these policies, at minimum, are going to entail an important transaction cost, and very likely a high infrastructure cost in terms of capacity to measure, methodologies of measurement, certification, and compliance methodologies for developing countries. I think beyond that, I see 2 or 3 other challenges as quite important, and to a large extent, the experience of the COVID crisis, is also revealing some areas of dangers. The first one may come from the trend to decarbonization of the supply chains. Here again, the point is not to discuss the legitimacy of decarbonization of supply chains. They are very legitimate policies. The thing is, what might be the impact on trade for LDCs? And for instance, you cannot exclude that in some extent, the impact could be negative. For instance, there is a very big effort which is being made in the maritime transportation sector to invest in decarbonization of boats and processes in ports and all this. This could lead to some form of concentration, oligopolistic concentration of the supply of maritime transportation to the detriment of minor companies which could not cope with that. That could, I'm not saying that it would happen or it would necessarily be bad, but that could have an impact on the definition of trade routes and the service to LDCs in terms of serving their exports. We have seen that, for instance, during the recent supply chain disruption. If you take the example of the cotton producers, you know, we have a group in the WTO called the C4, which is a major cotton producer, mainly from West Africa. And the delays for access to the boats and the container to take out the exports of cotton have been considerably multiplied, and with a lot of unpredictability from maritime transportation. So there is a risk here which is related to decarbonization. Third challenge, of course, food security. We are now in the middle of a very concerning crisis on food security, and this can give us a preview of what it could be in the future with major food security crises related to climate change. And what we see is that countries tend to take trade restrictive measures to keep the food on their territories. We have that trend, which is already significant these days. It is not beyond control. It has not been completely a panic mode or chain reaction. And I think to that extent, the Director General from the ministry, the German ministry, was referring to the results on MC12. Our conference has been helping in controlling the situation, but that gives you an example, a flavor of what can happen if trade responses to climate change are not being positively taking into account the interest of LDCs. So can we do something about it? Yes, I think that we need to try to keep trade policy as inclusive as possible, so as to minimize and to make sure that LDCs do not suffer this double punishment that I was talking about. I, for one, would see 4 directions in which we can work. The first one is an institutional response. To elaborate inclusive trade response to climate change, we need to discuss trade policy in inclusive forums. The WTO is one of these inclusive forums because you have North and South, developed and developing countries. And for instance, our DG, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, he's calling for a joint effort from economic agencies, the OECD, the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO to discuss about carbon pricing strategies and the elaboration of carbon. Why? Because we in the WTO, we bring these constituencies from developing countries to the table, and we can make sure that the design will be inclusive. We had the launch by some of our members recently of a climate change coalition of trade ministers, which also was sought through to be inclusive because it was a partnership between developed and developing countries. So institutional response first. Second, the financial response. It has been, I think, covered by Germany a lot in terms of the greening of aid for trade and the need to raise the stakes in technical assistance for the fight against climate change. I would add to that, we have a structural issue in the WTO, which is the reform of agricultural subsidies. For the last 5 years, it has been sought mainly through a market, non-trade distorting focus or paradigm. Now there is a new paradigm emerging, which is, can we repurpose those subsidies to help the fight against climate change? So there will be, I don't know if this agenda will develop rapidly in the WTO, several members are thinking about it. There will be a stake on the use of this colossal sum of money, because it's 800 billion annually for the world. So institutional response, financial response, regulatory response. I'll be short on that. I think we need to avoid the spaghetti bowl of standards on carbon methodologies for measurements or for traceability. It has been quite well developed. The problem is that we do not have a locus in the international institution to develop those elements of compatibility. I'm not even daring to talk about harmonization. Harmonization is very difficult, but at least have a place to talk. How do you measure? How do you compare? So that you do not have those hundreds and proliferation of standards, which might be as many obstacles to trade. And fourth, of course, the commercial response. We totally subscribe to the idea that LDCs and developing countries in general are part of the solution, because they have a lot of competitive advantage in their trade, which can be derived from a decarbonated economy. But they will need help to market those products, to find the niche, and to be able to reach the consumers. Vicky, you were kind enough to remind us that I have been serving in ITC, the International Trade Center. This is precisely the job of an institution like ITC, to help developing countries find opportunities, access market, access the buyers. So I think it's very important. Liberalizing decarbonated goods or positive goods for the environment will be also a major endeavor. I'll just stop there. These are my preliminary reflection, and happy to contribute more. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Pogam. That was very, very useful. And I like the fact that you pointed out that there's still a risk that we need to think about. The fact that during the decarbonization of these supply chains, some LDCs could end up marginalized, but then how do we help that? And you laid down a couple of points of how to actually make this much more inclusive from the institution and the regulatory standpoint. So those were very important points. And I think that already feeds into our thought processes of the solutions that we could come up with. So we have had from a country that provides support, that's Germany. We have had from the top multilateral agency that sort of provides aid for trade, the World Bank, and as well as from the WTO Secretariat, who oversees the discussions on some of these rules that support trade and climate change, especially for LDCs. So I think it's time that we had from a recipient of some of this type of support, and what practically embedding climate change into a country's trade policy could actually look like. So our next panelist is Mr. Sonam Phuntsho Wangdi, who is the Secretary of the National Environment Commission for the Royal Government of Bhutan, following 31 years in the Ministry of Economic Affairs. He is responsible for the overall regulation of the environmental sector. He is chair of the LDC group under the UNFCCC, and was selected as one of the 100 most influential people in climate policy by Apolitical. He's also a recipient of the Civil Service Gold Medal for 30 years of distinguished service. So Secretary Wangdi, it's an absolute pleasure to have you today. How is Bhutan actually embedding climate change into its trade policy, and what role can aid for trade, as we've heard from all our previous speakers, play in greening Bhutan's export basket? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, Honorable Chair, fellow panelists, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to participate as a panelist on this emerging subject, LDCs, trade and climate change, harnessing the opportunities of a net zero world. In my presentation, I will attempt to cover the environment and trade profile of my country, Bhutan, and challenges and expectations of Bhutan, as well as the LDCs under the net zero world. Bhutan, with a vulnerable and fragile mountain ecosystem, has made a conscious decision to maintain 60% forest cover in its constitution under its visionary monarchs. Currently, our forest cover is over 72%. Likewise, our carbon sequestration is 9.747 million tons of CO2 equivalent, and emissions are about 1/3, 3.8 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And we have reaffirmed our commitment to remain carbon neutral for all times to come. In addition, we also have these carbon offsets from hydropower project, 11 million tons under hydro projects in operation, and another 12 million tons of hydro projects under construction. These are being exported to India. For Bhutan and many other LDCs, our environment commitments are of the highest level of commitment that forgoes economic development to contribute to a healthier and happier planet. LDCs have committed to a vision to be on climate resilient pathways by 2030 and net zero by 2050 to ensure our communities and ecosystems thrive. Our environmental commitment is what industrialized countries committed some 300 years ago. Like most LDCs, Bhutan's export basket from its limited range of industries is at a low level of value and largely primary or semi-finished goods, while imports are finished or intermediaries of high value. Our major exports are hydroelectricity, almost 50%, non-ferrous metals, minerals, cement, and boulders. Our imports are fuel, machinery, rice, and vehicles. In terms of this composition, almost 10 items constitute about 80%, both in our export and import basket. And the total value of these are over little over $1 billion. And our trade is concentrated in the region where we have to compete with large competitors with lower environmental standards. Exporting to developed countries are difficult as we compete with either the same regional competitors for the same export markets or face even larger competitors in the industrial world, besides challenges of being landlocked. Bhutan and other LDCs are a museum of constraint and challenges for trade. We suffer from lack of trade facilitation infrastructure, both soft and hard components. TBT and SPS measures used as NTBs, trade finance, supply side constraints, limited market access, lack of export promotion, high transportation costs, high transaction costs at the borders, and limited institutional capacity for certification and accreditation of goods and services. In addition to trade challenges, Bhutan is also confronting a triple threat: climate emergencies, COVID-19, and possible debt traps. Bhutan has suffered severe disruptions in the economy with contraction of economy and loss of jobs. Bhutan is on the front line in terms of adverse impacts of climate change manifested in extreme weather events, floods, landslides, this is glacial lake outburst floods, forest fires, windstorms, and melting of glaciers. We've lost over 30% of our glacier in the last 50 years. Bhutan is struggling to finance adaptation and building resilience to climate change and to sustain the state of the environment. For LDCs and Bhutan to tap into the opportunities, exports must earn a premium over exports from countries that are carbon intensive. We can help reduce the challenges of imported emissions in major markets and contribute to raising global climate ambition. Net zero trade offers a potential to turn a historic disadvantage of lack of industries and low levels of pollution into a trade and climate advantage. But unfortunately, there are capacity and regulatory barriers, and overall, there must be increased and enhanced efforts from developed countries and UN agencies to support trade with LDCs. Some of the potential, if you take Bhutan as an example, our ferrosilicon exports from Bhutan to South Asian steel industries. Production is energy intensive, and Bhutan with its hydropower ensures the ferrosilicon produced is from clean energy source with minimum carbon footprint. But capturing higher value is difficult due to quality, production constraints, and competition with buyers preferring lower priced goods products, even if it's manufactured with high carbon intensity. Likewise, in agro-produce, where most people in the LDCs depend for livelihood, the requirements for organic certification, SPS certification, and now carbon certification makes it difficult for many LDCs to comply even when farming in our countries is eco-friendly and less carbon intensive. However, securing climate-compatible development will only be possible through aligning climate and trade policy in a way that works for the most vulnerable countries, such as Bhutan and LDCs. Too often, we have taken the climate burden, even though we are the victims for no fault of ours. Bhutan and many LDCs have deep concerns that Brussels Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, will impede exports from LDCs and unintentionally distort trade to our disadvantage. LDCs don't seem to be exempted from the proposed CBAM and will require support for carbon accounting and other new requirements. Such support could come from aid for trade, but there is yet to be a conceptual framework to integrate these considerations. The unintended consequences of CBAM will adversely affect trade of LDCs, and therefore LDCs and graduating countries need support for this changing trade landscape, covering physical and regulatory effects. CBAM should not result in penalizing development and prosperity. The international climate and trade architecture both have mechanisms for dispersing concessional finance to low-income countries. Climate finance is intended to support mitigation and adaptation action, and we need to see fulfillment of pledges in climate finance. Likewise, aid for trade is intended to build supply-side capacity and trade-related infrastructure and must be attuned to the emerging requirements of trade and climate. By enabling LDCs to not only comply with traditional global trade requirements, but also with climate in trade. Bhutan sees two levels of support. First, in assisting the building of domestic productive capacity to be able to participate in the global market for green goods and services. And second, in supporting domestic clean energy transition so that LDCs don't face the issue of imported emissions. Going forward, climate finance and aid for trade need to support LDCs to expand productive capacity in low carbon industrialization and achieve a green structural transformation. Support alone will not suffice. LDCs need to be engaged in drawing of the new global architecture of climate and trade. And so far, we have not been consulted. LDCs need to have ownership of the emerging global climate and trade architecture. Otherwise, LDCs may suffer from a green squeeze, whereby stringent and expensive standards developed in the other advanced or large developing countries' context are imposed on the most vulnerable people in the LDCs. Consumers in the industrialized world are willing to pay more for green goods and services, including organic. But from Bhutan's experience, the green squeeze by importers and retailers in the production and distribution chain do not offer a price premium to small farmers and producers in the LDCs. The race to squeeze price continues while expecting the most vulnerable countries and people with resource limitations to help raise global climate ambition. Countries with high environmental credentials like Bhutan should be supported in its trade with automatic recognition and prioritization of its exports as clean and green and fit for purpose as long as we remain carbon neutral. This will be a big boost to build productive capacity and help increase climate and trade ambition. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Wangdi. You've raised some very, very critical points from the LDC perspective, and stressing the point that these LDCs require support for that transition, and the fact that there have been several pledges made in terms of climate finance, but the money hasn't really been dispersed over time. And I think that brings us really to the point of today's discussion, just trying to discuss how Aid for Trade should be geared towards helping this sustainable transition. Now, I'm sort of reminded of the recent CBAM proposal that said that that all the revenues that apparently would come from the CBAM implementation could be used to support LDCs. Of course, we're not sure whether that will come to pass, but we would like to hold the people that sort of put together that proposal we should hold them accountable, so to say, because as you rightly pointed out, the developed world has been contributing to GHG emissions over time, and yet the impacts are really being felt by the developing world, such as Bhutan. To sort of round this excellent discussion up, it is an absolute pleasure to invite Mr. Ratnaka Adhikari, who has served as the Executive Director of the Enhanced Integrated Framework at the World Trade Organization since October 2013. So prior to this assignment, Mr. Adhikari was the Chief Executive Director of the South Asia Watch on Trade, Economics and Environment, a Kathmandu-based regional think tank. So Mr. Adhikari, I think Aid for Trade is really the EIF sort of purview, and since you roll out Aid for Trade, especially for LDCs, could you share some of the lessons from the EIF project support to LDC trade in low carbon products, and how EIF more broadly helps LDCs leverage their carbon competitiveness in export markets? We already had from Secretary Wangdi how difficult it was for Bhutan to even sort of green its export products, and the fact that smaller farmers are not fetching a price premium, and yet the trends are really going towards attracting more sort of greener trade. So what are your perspectives in this regard? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for providing this opportunity. And let me say that I'm very pleased to join with the government of Germany and the World Bank to organize this event together with my colleagues. And really, when we are talking about the LDCs, they are the most vulnerable. They are the lowest emitters. But then opportunities that we've discussed can be summed up as the opportunities around trade and climate actions, competitiveness, finance, use of technology, and there are several other opportunities. So, but then, like with many opportunities, there's always a challenge in harnessing the true potential of opportunities because of capacity constraints, because of institutional constraints, and because of lack of financing. So this is the kind of challenge that we have. In order to address these challenges, what I would like to present here is that there are 5 areas through which the EIF has been contributing, working hand in hand with various partners, including the government of Germany, World Bank, ITC, WTO, and few others. Let me start with the analytical work. When we talk about the analytical work, the diagnostic trade integration study is the most important analytical work that we support on the ground, and World Bank is one of the major contributors to these studies. So what we do in the diagnostic trade integration study is to first analyze, what are the opportunities that exist on the trade arena and what are the challenges and constraints. In order to address these constraints, we help them to come up with some, ideas on how these constraints can be sort of addressed. But at the same time, what we've done since 2016 is to include environment as a cross-cutting issue within our DTIS, and which has actually resulted in a plethora of work relating to trade and its interaction with environment in general and climate change as well. I can give you the example of recently concluded DTISs, for example, in Cambodia, Laos, PDR, and Nepal, where these issues are highlighted. And Nepal is one such country where I was actually actively engaged in, supporting the process as well. One of the 4 criteria that were included in the selection of sectors to be prioritized was the environmental consideration. So that's one example. And mention needs to be made of the of Tuvalu, the Pacific island country, which is facing significant climate-related vulnerability. And they have actually devoted more than a quarter of the report in analyzing the implication of climate change to their trade and competitiveness. So that's the analytical bit. The second example that I would like to highlight is the example of climate change mitigation. So in relation to that, I just want to provide 3 examples. One is from Mali, where we supported a gum arabic project, which actually essentially entails planting 10,000 hectares of land with acacia tree. The objective of planting acacia tree was to be able to extract gum arabic, but also at the same time, this became a part of a great green wall of Africa initiative, the objective of which was to prevent the desert from Sahara desert from moving inwards into the country. And this has actually helped the country in significantly mitigating the impact of climate change. Similarly, in Ethiopia, we are working in collaboration with the ICP, this organization which is working on insect health. And they are supporting a project, actually implementing a project where they have planted 400,000 bee forage seedling, and this is protecting biodiversity and also helping in climate mitigation. And finally, we are supporting projects in West African countries, not only in West African countries, but also a regional project in collaboration with the Global Shea Alliance to provide value chain support on shea butter sector. And this has actually contributed to carbon sequestration. So this is the example of the work that we've done in order to help in climate change mitigation. Then the third example is that of paperless trade. As a trade facilitation, nobody thought that trade facilitation actually can contribute to climate change mitigation, but then it actually did. We are supporting a project for 4 graduating countries in Asia Pacific region, including Bhutan. So now you need to be aware of that, and I'll provide you further details on that. Bhutan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Timor-Leste, where we are supporting this project, working together with the UNESCAP in order to implement paperless trade project, digitizing trade procedure. But Vanuatu actually is another, project through another directly supported project implemented by UNCTAD, has resulted in significant reduction in the use of paper, as a result of which they were able to reduce their carbon CO2 emissions by 5,827 kgs, and Vanuatu became the top most important countries in the amongst Asia Pacific, the small island developing countries, to attain this level of the best, sustainable and digital trade facilitation infrastructure and facility. So they got this, they are accredited for that. The project is contributed to that objective. And the fourth one is the one of circular economy, where in Rwanda, we provided support to them to develop the e-waste strategy, but at the same time, the government went ahead through our support to develop a public-private mechanism whereby they established an e-waste recycling facility. In 1 year, the facility collected 3,000 tons of e-waste, sold or donated nearly 2,000 refurbished computer skills, and created over 400 jobs. The facility also offers collection services for neighboring Uganda, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Burundi, and export circuit boards to Dubai to recycle precious metals. And finally, linking the trade and climate worlds, what we've tried to do is to partner with Overseas Development Institute in the run-up to COP26 to develop capacity of trade officials and the climate change officials to come together and engage in a discussion to allow them to understand each other's perspective better. But at the same time, we also conducted a few studies, including the one on how LDCs can access climate finance, and the other one on how the LDCs can better harness technologies in the context of climate change and prepare for carbon market and standards. We've already implemented one of the recommendations coming from these studies by helping institutional coordination to mobilize climate finance in the Gambia. This is one such example. And looking forward, the LDCs need critical support to design bankable projects for resource mobilization, to reinforce their policy and institutional coordination, and more critically, to improve their business environments for attracting essential private investment, so that the opportunities that we highlighted in the beginning of this discussion, or throughout this discussion, can be utilized, can be harnessed actually by LDCs. So I thank you for your kind attention, and we look forward to continued collaboration with our partners.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. Ratnaka. You mentioned trade facilitation and the fact that it does contribute to reducing emissions through reducing the amount of paper. We completely agree, and we also see that in our research in the World Bank. Even from the food perspective, if at the border point you have a truck that is transporting tomatoes or any other perishables, the longer it takes at the border means you're going to lose that food probably, and then that would result in food waste emissions. So I think it goes without saying that trade facilitation is very key at this stage to ensure mitigation of emissions, especially at the border points. But thank you very much for your very many different examples. We have seen all across the world. EIF is doing several interventions to try and help sort of address some of those supply side constraints. So that's very important. And I see very strong synergies between what you mentioned in the DTIS work and what Mona mentioned in the CCDR work. And obviously we'll continue as institutions collaborating to see how we could do some of that work together. Thank you. So we're practically almost done, but then I have a couple of questions, and my panelists have 2 minutes or maybe 1 minute and 30 seconds to respond to these questions. So they'll be just very quick fire, and I'll start with Director Mona Haddad. So Director Mona Haddad, you mentioned the need for a holistic view when approaching the climate crisis. Why is it so important that we do this? Why holistic?
Thank you, Vicky. Maybe I can tell you first about my daughter, who's a climate change fan. And of course, when you realize the enormity of this problem, you think only about solutions that address climate change. And I had to explain to her that maybe some people don't have a job or they don't have enough to eat. So I think it's really important to take a holistic approach, because developing countries, and especially LDCs, they need to grow, they need to create jobs, they need better jobs, they need to raise their incomes. And it's very important to balance the climate agenda with the development agenda. And of course, the best is to find solutions that address both, and not really one at the expense of the other. We also need to realize that many developing countries, governments are constrained by the fiscal resources that they have. They have a small fiscal space, and they often are burdened by large debts. And it's therefore important for them to prioritize where their public spending is going to go, and to ensure that whatever they can spend on climate change or investing for climate change is also well balanced with their other priorities, including health and education and infrastructure. And whenever possible, to allow the private sector to come in and provide some of these services, including in energy, which is certainly very important, and perhaps part of it can be delivered by the private sector, especially in renewable energy. So really, this is what I meant by a holistic approach. There are lots of opportunities, as I mentioned before, for the climate to actually become kind of a market for developing countries by greening agriculture, by greening the manufacturing, especially in those countries where they are still at a low base, and therefore taking advantage of these of the climate movement in a way, and the climate imperatives to start build back better, as we like to say in this part of the world. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you so much, Mona. Indeed, build back better. We hear it a lot, and it's very important in so many respects. So my next question is to Ambassador Pogam. You talked about the spaghetti ball of standards and traceability and the lack of a focal body that could sort of help oversee this. What could be a starting point for this step of discussion? Well, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Vicky. This is a tough one, but we have a beginning of an answer. It happened that there is in Geneva a world standards cooperation between three major standard setting bodies, the most famous one being ISO, but you also have ITU for telecommunication and IEC for electric appliances. So we have started a dialogue with them to see whether we could maybe start organizing this place, which needs to bring in several institutions. The WTO, for instance, is not a standard setter organization. But we look at the fact that standards are non-discriminatory. So we have this sort of value chains of people who are working on standards that we need to build. And I think Geneva is a good place. As Mona said, the private sector will have to be called in, because they will have also some standards. You know, the beauty of all this corporate net zero strategy, you don't know what is public, you don't know what is private, you just want to look what is working actually. But at one moment, all these people have to talk. So we will probably start with a workshop at fall, closed door, just to explore, and maybe come out with a more ambitious visions, possibly towards the G20 at one point, which could be a place where some impetus would be given. Not sure of my answer. I'm just telling you what I have in the kitchen.
It is a little bit more concrete than I would have expected. So thank you very much for sort of painting a picture of us for what it could actually look like. No, thank you very much. I know you have to leave shortly, but it has been an absolute pleasure to have you sharing your thoughts in this session. My next question is to Secretary Wang Di. Very quickly, you mentioned that Bhutan is a museum of constraints and challenges to trade. I liked the way you phrased that. What are the immediate quick wins in your view in the short run that you think sort of Bhutan could implement in order to address some of those challenges?
Thank you, Vicky. Before I go to the question, the LDC chair, I handed over to Senegal in January. So I'm not the current LDC chair. On this question, I was talking not only for Bhutan as a museum of constraint challenges, for overall LDCs in general, but even for Bhutan. I mean, we're a landlocked country, so we've our share of problems. And the last few years, the last 5-6 years have been very difficult. Countries have become very nationalistic. They've used NTMs, NTBs on many agricultural products. So we've on mineral exports. So we bore the brunt of that. Now for Bhutan in particular, we have being a landlocked country, and as of now, the only port that we use is the Kolkata port, and that is given the transportation, the roads in India, it could be like anywhere between 3 to 6 days. Getting there, and from there again everything starts in terms of your export documentation starts from there. So therefore the transportation is very expensive. It could be almost 40% of the cost of the product. So Bhutan has its challenges. Now we are working. I mean, and I must, in fact, I have been my friend Ratnakar, he mentioned I used to be director of trade in Bhutan, and the first EIF project, I was the head of the trade department. So I've worked very closely, and we've done a lot together. But it's always there's more to do, and we are building a string of dry ports. We've already, the first one is complete in a western border, and across from the west, we've got a 600 plus kilometer southern border. So as we go in the south towards the east, the central part, then the eastern part, we're building dry ports. And through that, we are hoping that we will be able to reduce our transportation costs. We are also trying to build, have MRIs, MRAs, and build laboratories so that we would be able to get through the problem of various lab reports and certification. But it's been difficult during the COVID periods. Everything has, in fact, sometimes I used to ask, what happened to WTO? And unfortunately, Bhutan is not a member yet. So for us, with every country, if you have to trade, it's starting the process all over again, negotiating a trade agreement and, negotiating with all standard agencies and what have you. So for us, that way, truly, we face challenges, but we are working on it. And in time to come, we would have this string of dry ports, maybe in the next 2 to 3 years. And also, we've in fact have agreement now Bangladesh to use their ports also, both the ports in Bangladesh, Mongla and Chittagong, and the Kolkata port. And we have the right to use also the Indian ports, other Mumbai and Chennai, but then that's too far from here. So hopefully, with all these things coming, and then with this green trade, we hope we will benefit from this green trade, because we are the first carbon negative country by leaps and bounds, and everything that we grow here is, and what we extract here is very environment friendly. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Secretary Wangdi. And I think it goes without saying that accelerating accession to the WTO should be also on your list to safeguard some of the sort of interventions that you've mentioned. No, thank you. That was an excellent answer. So for Executive Director Ratnaka, no, I do not have a question for you because in a way you're sort of our host, but I will give you a chance to have give us a last word, maybe what concluding sort of perspective that you'd like to share very briefly, and then we could close.
I just want to emphasize literally one point, and which is about the power of partnership. See, when we talk about all of these opportunities are there, and if EIF were to work alone in a kind of a silo, would not be able to do so much that it has been able to do, having worked with partners. I just give you 2 examples. One is the example of, again, coming back to Vanuatu, which was, it was like, government of Vanuatu and Australia also contributed resources and expertise to implement that project. And we worked together with UNCTAD in order to support the implementation of the project. And as a result of which we were able to gain that traction from the government as well as from our partner, and we were able to showcase that as an example, right? Because they got this the #1 award as whatever. That's one area where I provided this example of a partnership. And when we talk about partnership, it goes beyond the traditional partners, such as the World Bank, such as UNCTAD or ITC, or the government of Germany, Australia, and others. It goes now right into the heart of the financing mechanism, for which it is important for LDCs to work together with other sort of partners, such as the private sector. The examples of public-private partnership for e-waste in Rwanda is one such example. But at the same time, if we were to help LDCs to harness these potential finances, would be the most important. Finance would be the most important sort of element. And for that, mechanisms such as aid for trade can be utilized to leverage private sector finance. It can be utilized to leverage blended finance. It can be utilized to leverage impact investment and other kinds of innovative financing, which are so important to help these LDCs to harness these potential that we just discussed this afternoon. I stop here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ratnaka. So very briefly, we're closing in 30 seconds, but in those 30 seconds, I just want to mention sort of 5 main takeaways from this session. I think number one is the need for important diagnostics. We had that from the DTIS angle, we had that from the CCDRs of the World Bank, but just everywhere, the need for diagnostics so that we can sort of design appropriate policy interventions. The other point was the need to integrate climate into trade policy. We had that from Bhutan, but also a need to maintain a holistic approach, as Mona stressed, between development and climate. That's very important to ensure that there are no marginalized groups in that after the intervention. Then also the need for inclusion. DDG Pogam stressed that the need for LDCs to participate in rules making, they need to be in the room, otherwise the rules that come out of that room may not favor them. So it is important that they're sort of facilitated to participate. And then another one is support for addressing the sort of supply side constraints to be green export ready, because the opportunities are there. We've had throughout the entire session, there are very many opportunities, but how do we address some of those supply side constraints? And then the last one is the importance of partnerships. And we just had from Ratnaka stressing that even the LDCs need to partner so that they can then push some of their challenges forward and find better solutions for them. I hope I have wrapped that very quickly, but this has been an absolute delight moderating today's session. And I really want to thank all the excellent panelists for their top-notch interventions, and for our organizers, Germany, EIF, and the World Bank. You've really been a sort of great support system for this session. And yeah, with that, I'll say goodbye to everybody. Enjoy, but remember and reflect upon some of the things that we've discussed today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you very
Take
much.
care.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you,
All-
colleagues.
Thank you very much, Vicky,
Bye.
and good to see you, Ratna, and good to see you, Mr. Sonam, and Jean-Marie left already. Thank you, Simon, as well.
Pleasure,
and
Mona.
everybody.
Yeah,
Good to see
pleasure,
you.
pleasure,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
all right.
Simon
Thanks
and
to
Pierre.
Simon.
Thank you.
Simon and
My
Pierre.
heroes, if you
Yeah,
hear
are
me.
the heroes. Yeah.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
Thanks so, bye.